Hello students, welcome to SR Concepts, and in this video we will discuss the next topic, that is sliding and static friction. But before understanding that topic, there is a little point that I want to describe to you. So suppose there is a mat which is kept on a floor, So this is easy to drag or move the mat on the floor when no one is sitting on the mat. But when someone sits on the mat, this is hard to move the mat. Means you have to apply a large amount of force to move the mat or drag the mat on the floor. Why does this happen? Because when someone sits on the mat, the irregularities on the surface of the mat and the irregularities on the surface of the floor are more tightly interlocked. And because of more tight interlocking, more force need to be applied to move the mat. That means at that time there is more force of friction working between the mat and the floor. So we can say when the two surfaces are pressed hard against each other, there is more friction between the two. Now let's understand what is static and what is sliding friction. Suppose this is a heavy box and you are trying to push the box to move the box. You will feel that you will have to apply a larger amount of force to bring the box in motion or to start the sliding of the box. But once the box starts moving, you will have to apply less amount of force to maintain its motion in the same speed, to maintain its sliding in the same speed. So we can say while the box is at rest and it just starts to move, larger amount of force need to be applied. That means at this time you have to overcome larger amount of friction. So when something is rest and it just starts to move, there is larger force of friction working between the two surfaces which are in contact. But while something is moving, while something is sliding, you have to overcome lesser amount of friction. That means sliding friction is lesser. So there are two types of friction. One, which is called static friction, is the friction which is working when something is at rest or it just starts to move, right? But while something is already in motion, at that time the friction which is working is called sliding friction. Okay, now let's understand friction, a necessary evil. That means friction in some situation is very much necessary, desirable, while in some situation it is just an evil, means in some situation it is not desirable. So we can say that friction is both, means good and bad, or we can say friction has its own advantages and disadvantages. So let's talk about the advantages of friction. Suppose we have a cooler. It is very easy to hold a cooler, but if you have a borosilicate glass which has very smooth surfaces, right? Suppose a borosilicate glass has a little thin layer of oil over it. Is it easy to hold it? No, it is not easy, because when there is oil, there is very little friction between our fingers and the glass. So to hold a glass, we need friction. So in this situation, we want friction. So because of friction, we can hold the glass. In the same way, recall that while you are trying to move on a muddy track, or when you are trying to walk on a wet marble floor, it is very hard to walk over them. Why? Because on a wet marble floor, there is very little amount of friction. What does it show? That to walk on any kind of surface, the friction between the legs and the floor is very important. So in these situations we want to increase the friction, and this is why the soles of your shoes, the soles of your chappals are always, have certain irregularities over them, so that there is more amount of friction between the floor, between the road and your shoes. Okay, there are certain more advantages of friction. For example, you can write with the help of a pen or pencil on a paper because of friction. If there is no friction between the pen or pencil, suppose this is the pen, this is the pen, and this is the paper. So if there is friction, you are able to write. But if there is no friction, you are not able to write. So the friction between the pen and paper is very much required for proper writing. In the same way, you have seen that a teacher writes on a blackboard with the help of a chalk. So friction between the chalk and the blackboard helps a teacher write properly. Suppose this is the surface of the blackboard. The surface is always rough. Okay, and this is the chalk. This is the chalk. So when the surface of the chalk and the surface of the board rub against each other, what happens that a few particles of the chalk, a little material from the chalk get stick to these irregularities, and this is how they leave a mark on the blackboard. So this is very much important that there should be a friction between the chalk and the blackboard, right? So a chalk cannot properly write on a smooth surface. In the same way, the rough in the same way you will experience um, that the friction between the iron nail and the wall is very much important. Why? Because of friction only you are able to insert the iron nail into the wall. If there is no friction, if there is no roughness, then you will not be able to insert the iron nail into the wall. So it is easy to fix an iron nail on a wall which has rough surface as compared to the wall which has very much smooth and hard surfaces. Alright. Next, something very important is written here. What is written? If an object starts moving, it would never stop if there were no friction. So if there is no friction, it will not stop. It will never stop. Right? Had there been no friction between the tires and the automobiles and the road, they could not be started or stopped or even turned to change the direction of the motion. So the friction between the tires of a car, suppose this is a car or this is a truck, and these are the tires and this is the road. So friction between the tires and the road is very much important, because without friction neither the thing will stop moving, neither the vehicle will stop moving, and nor you will be able to change the direction of the vehicle while it is moving. So in order to increase the friction between the road and the tires, you know that we make treaded tires, means the tires which have irregularities, and also you know that road is never smooth, it has irregularities. We make the road irregular because we want to increase the friction between the tire and the road, right? So a number of advantages of friction we have seen. One more thing is that no building can be built without friction. The building cannot be constructed because the friction is very much required between the bricks, between the cement and the bricks, right? So building can be constructed only because there is friction. So here we see a number of places where friction is required. You see that the friction between the matchstick head and the matchbox is very much important for burning a matchstick. Let's look at certain bad effects of friction, or certain disadvantages of friction. Means we will look at the situation in which friction is an evil. What is the disadvantage of friction? Let's understand. First of all, it wears out the materials where whether they are screws or they are ball bearings or soles of your shoes. So you see that the screws, ball bearings, soles of your shoes, they all get wear out because of friction. After some time your shoe soles get smooth, and uh, friction between the soles and the floor is very little, and there is a chance of slipping over the floor, right? In the same way, you must have seen the worn out steps of foot over bridges at the railway stations. So the foot over bridges get worn out because of friction. One more thing to note is that friction produces heat. When you rub your palm together for a few minutes, you feel warmer, right? In the same way, when you strike a matchstick against the rough surface of the matchbox or any other rough surface, it catches fire. This is because uh, due to friction, the material in the matchstick head becomes hot, right? Heat is being produced and it becomes hot, and on reaching its ignition temperature, the matchstick head starts burning. So here you can see that the friction between the matchstick head and the matchbox is very much important for its burning. So we can say that friction produces heat. You have also noticed that when you are running a mixer grinder, right, the jar of the mixer becomes very hot. This is due to friction. Not only this, in most of the machines, the parts which are rubbing together while the machine is running, the friction between these parts produces a lot of heat, and this heat is actually just a wastage of energy, right? So while the machine is moving, the machine parts are moving, a lot of energy is wasted to overcome the friction between the parts, and this movement generates energy, heat energy, and the heat energy produced is actually the wastage of the energy while the machine is moving. Now, so here you can see that in many cases we require friction, but in other cases we want to decrease friction. So how we can increase friction or how we can decrease or reduce friction? Dear students, have you ever thought why the sole in your shoe is grooved? So the soles are grooved in order to increase the friction and in order to make better grip, in order to make a better grip on the floor, right? In the same way, you can see that the tires of most of vehicles are irregular, or we can say they are threaded. These irregularities actually increase the friction between the road. So we can say that if we want to increase friction, we have to increase irregularities of the surfaces. All right, we we deliberately increase the friction by using brake pads in the brake systems of the automobiles and the bicycles. What happens, there are brake pads in the bicycle. So when you apply brakes, the brake pads come in contact with the surface of the rim, right? And rim and the friction between the rim and the brake pads uh, is important for applying the brakes or for working of the brakes to stop the bicycle. In the same way, the students, you can see that kabaddi players apply apply certain amount of soil over their hands to increase the grip on the body of the opponent. In the same way, gymnasts also apply certain coarse substances on their hands to increase the friction or to increase the better grip on the objects. Right. So kabaddi players and the gymnasts apply certain coarse materials on their hands. All right. So now now we have seen that in order to increase the friction, we have to increase the roughness of the surfaces, right? In case of tires, in case of soles, in case of hands of the gymnasts, in all these cases you have seen that they increase the roughness of the surfaces, and by increasing the roughness of the surfaces we can increase the friction. Now how to decrease the friction? Dear students, you see that while you play carom, you you sprinkle certain fine powder over it, right, to decrease the roughness or to decrease the friction of the carom board, right? So by sprinkling a fine powder, we are actually decreasing the friction on the surface of the carom board. In the same way, in the same way, if you add a few drops of oil on the hinges of the door, you will see that the doors move smoothly, because the oil makes a layer to reduce the friction between the surfaces of the hinges, and that's why the hinges start moving very easily. A bicycle and a motor machine uses grease between the moving parts of these machines, right, to decrease the friction. So in all the above cases, we want to reduce friction in order to increase the efficiency. What happens when you apply some oil, some grease or graphite? We can reduce the friction. How? Because when you suppose this is the surface, and this has irregularities. So when you apply certain oil, suppose oil or grease make a layer over it, right, over the irregularities. In this way the oil decreases the interlocking of irregularities, the oil makes a layer over it, the grease or oil makes a layer over the irregularities, reduces the irregularities and reduces the friction, right? So when you are using these materials like oil, grease and graphite, they all work as a lubricant. So the substances which reduce friction, right, are called lubricants. Here you can see how the things work, how the lubricants work. The material which reduce friction are called lubricants. Suppose this is the surface 1, this is the surface 1 and this is the surface 2, and you want to decrease the friction. What you need to do, you need to apply a little lubricant over it. So this light colored is lubricant. What will happen, the lubricant will fill the irregularities like this, and irregularities will not interlock with each other. In this way the lubricants will reduce the friction. Okay, so in order to reduce the friction we have to apply lubricants, because lubricant make a thin layer and reduce the irregularities or fill up the irregularities between the surfaces. In certain machines there is no usage of lubricants required or desirable. In that case we use air cushion, right? Okay, so now let's understand a very important point, that friction cannot be zero, cannot be reduced to zero. Why? Because no two surfaces are perfectly smooth. Even if you apply a lubricant, there are irregularities, right? So you cannot produce a surface with zero irregularities. That's why you cannot reduce the friction to zero. Restraints will reduce friction. You have seen that luggages have wheels like this. These are called rollers. By applying these rollers, even a child can move the luggage. Why this is happening? This is because of rolling friction. What is rolling friction? Here you can see what you need to do. You need to perform this activity. First of all, you will take a few pencils like this which have cylindrical shapes, right? So the pencils should be cylindrical. Now you have to put a heavy book over it. Try to push the book, and after that you remove the pencils, and now again try to push the book on the table. You will feel that when you are pushing the book while the pencils have been put, this is very easy to move the book, but to slide the book it is very hard. What happens at this situation when the pencils are kept? Actually only the pencils are rolling over the surface of the table. So the friction which is working while something is rolling over the table is called a rolling friction. For example, you have performed an activity where you made a sliding a slopey surface, and you left a pencil cell over it to roll it down. So when something is rolling, the friction which is called which is working is called rolling friction. So while something is rolling, this is called rolling friction, right? While something is rolling, the friction which is working between the surfaces are called rolling friction. What is written? When one body rolls over the surface of another body, the resistance to its motion is called rolling friction. This means rolling friction is always smaller than sliding friction, and that's why whenever the sliding friction is replaced by rolling friction, there is lesser amount of friction. So the common examples of use of ball bearings between common examples of using rolling friction is the use of ball bearings between the hubs and axles of the ceiling fans and bicycles. Here you can see this is a ball bearing, this is a ball bearing, right? And in ball bearing, what happens? One surface is rolling over the other surface because of these little balls, right? So when suppose this is the axle and this is the hub, right? So when you are using a ball bearing, you are actually replacing the sliding friction by rolling friction, and you are decreasing the force of friction. Now let's understand what is fluid friction. This means whenever something is moves in a fluid or in a gas or a liquid, there is a friction which is called fluid friction. For in because the gas and liquid both are called fluids in science, so the friction applied by gas and liquid is called fluid friction, right? And you know, today the things like aeroplanes or the aeroplanes or the ships have a particular shape that is called streamlined shape. The streamlined shape is always pointed at the ends and broad in the middles, right? Such a shape, that is called streamlined shape, reduces the fluid friction or helps in overcoming the fluid friction. The ideas for making streamlined shape comes from nature, as you can see that the birds and fishes already have a streamlined shape, which make it easier to overcome the fluid friction. Distance, the fluid friction is also called the drag. The fluid friction is also called the drag, means the friction applied by gas or the liquid is also called drag, and this can be overcome by a streamlined shape. Thank you for watching this video. Dear students, prepare your notes, prepare separate lists for advantages of friction and disadvantages of friction. Means you have to make the lists of one list in which you will list all those situations where friction is required, and another list of those situations in which the friction is actually undesirable. You also have to make the list of those methods which either decrease the friction or increase the friction. Make a separate list in which first list you will make the list of those methods which are used to increase the friction, and in another list you will make the list of those situations, those methods which are used to reduce the friction. Thank you for watching this video. Keep preparing your notes, keep learning from your NCERT textbook, underline each and everything, right? In the next video we will discuss about the NCERT solutions of this chapter. Thank you.